The smoky haze of the Green Mill cocktail lounge hung thick in the air as Tommy, the hammer Castellano, adjusted his suspenders and checked his pocket watch. It was 11:30 on a cold February night in 1925, and the speakeasy was packed with Chicago's finest criminals, politicians, and socialites all pretending they weren't breaking the Volstead Act with every sip of bootleg gin. Tommy ran one of the most profitable operations on the North Side, controlling 3 speakeasies, 2 distilleries hidden in abandoned warehouses, and a network of runners who moved Canadian whiskey through the city like clockwork. At 32, he had everything a man could want in this lawless era: money, power, respect, and fear from his enemies. What he didn't have was time for the woman who waited for him every night in their apartment above Marcelli's bakery. Rosa Benedetto had been Tommy's girl for 4 years now, ever since he'd swept her off her feet at a church social in Little Italy. She was the daughter of honest Italian immigrants who ran a small grocery store on Taylor Street, and she'd fallen hard for the charming young man who always had cash in his pocket and promises on his lips. Back then, Tommy would bring her flowers every Sunday after Mass, take her to picture shows, and talk about the house they'd buy once he'd made enough money to go legitimate. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. Now Rosa spent her evenings alone, listening to the radio programs and mending Tommy's shirts while he conducted business in smoke-filled back rooms across the city. She'd learned not to ask where he went or when he'd be home. The few times she'd complained about his absence, Tommy had erupted in anger, reminding her that everything he did was for their future, that a man had to make his mark in this world before he could settle down properly. "You got everything you need, don't you?" He'd snap, gesturing at their well-furnished apartment with its electric lights and modern icebox. "You got nice dresses, you got food on the table, you got a roof over your head. What more do you want?" What Rosa wanted was the man she'd fallen in love with, not the cold stranger who came home smelling of cigarettes and cheap perfume, counting stacks of bills while barely acknowledging her presence. She wanted Sunday dinners with his family like they used to have, walks along Lake Michigan, and conversations that didn't revolve around territory disputes and rival gangs. Tonight was no different. Tommy sat at their kitchen table, dividing the evening's take from his 3 establishments, while Rosa heated up the plate of pasta she'd kept warm for him since 7 o'clock. The radio played a scratchy recording of "Yes Sir, That's My Baby" while she watched him work, noting how his dark hair was perfectly slicked back despite the late hour, how his expensive suit jacket hung on the back of his chair like armor he'd temporarily discarded. "Good night tonight," Tommy muttered without looking up from his counting. The new shipment from Detroit came through clean. No problems with the feds, no problems with Moran's boys. George Bugs. Moran controlled the rival North Side gang, and tensions between their organizations had been escalating for months. Tommy's crew had been muscling in on territory that Moran considered his own, leading to a series of increasingly violent confrontations that had Rosa constantly worried about her man's safety. "That's good," Rosa replied quietly, setting his plate on the table next to his money. "Mrs. Castellano came by the bakery today. She asked about you, wondered when we're coming for Sunday dinner again." Tommy's mother had been dropping hints about grandchildren and marriage for the past 2 years, but Tommy always found excuses to avoid family gatherings. Business was too important, too demanding. There would be time for family obligations later, when he'd secured his position in the city's underworld hierarchy. "Tell her soon," Tommy said, finally looking up at Rosa. Even in the dim lamplight, she was beautiful, with her dark eyes and olive skin, her black hair pinned up in the fashionable bob style all the modern girls wore. Sometimes he forgot how lucky he was to have her. How many other men in his line of work came home to empty apartments and paid companionship. But those moments of appreciation were fleeting. Tommy's mind was already moving to tomorrow's challenges: a shipment coming in from Canada, a meeting with corrupt police officials who needed their monthly payments, and rumors that Moran was planning something big. Romance and domestic bliss were luxuries he couldn't afford in a business where weakness could get you killed. As Rosa cleared away his empty plate, Tommy barely noticed the way her shoulders sagged with disappointment, or how she'd stopped humming along to the radio songs she used to love. He was already planning his next move in the deadly chess game that ruled his life, unaware that his neglect was creating a vulnerability that his enemies would soon discover and exploit. The stage was set for a reckoning that would shake Tommy's carefully constructed world to its foundations. 3 weeks later, The March winds whipped through Chicago's streets as Rosa made her way to Benedetto's Market, her family's grocery store on Taylor Street. The morning air still carried the bite of winter, and she pulled her wool coat tighter as she navigated the crowded sidewalks of Little Italy. The neighborhood was alive with the sounds of vendors hawking their wares, children playing stickball in the alleys, and the constant rumble of Model T Fords navigating the cobblestone streets. Tommy had left before dawn again, muttering something about a meeting with his Lieutenant Mickey Torino and a problem at the warehouse on Halstead Street. Rosa had stopped asking for details months ago. The less she knew about his business, the safer she was, or so Tommy claimed. But the isolation was eating away at her spirit like acid on metal. At the market, her father Antonio was arranging fresh vegetables that had arrived on the morning train from the farmlands outside the city. Despite Prohibition's grip on the nation, legitimate businesses like theirs continued to serve the community's daily needs. Antonio had built his reputation on honest dealings and fair prices, a stark contrast to the world his daughter had become entangled with through her relationship with Tommy. "Rosa, Mia cara," her father called out as she entered, his weathered hands setting down a crate of apples. "You look tired. That boy of yours keeping you up with his comings and goings." Rosa forced a smile, not wanting to burden her father with her troubles. Antonio had never approved of Tommy, sensing danger in the young man's expensive clothes and mysterious income long before the neighborhood rumors confirmed his suspicions. "I'm fine, Papa. Just couldn't sleep with all the wind rattling the windows," as she helped arrange the produce display. The bell above the door chimed, and a man Rosa had never seen before stepped inside. He was tall and lean, with sandy brown hair slicked back in the popular style and pale blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His suit was well tailored but not flashy, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence that commanded attention without demanding it. "Good morning," the stranger said, his voice carrying a slight Irish accent. "I'm looking for some fresh fruit for my grandmother. She's particular about her apples." Antonio stepped forward, eager to serve a new customer. "You've come to the right place, friend. These apples came in this morning from the orchards in Michigan, sweet as honey and crisp as autumn air." While her father engaged the customer in conversation about produce quality, Rosa found herself stealing glances at the newcomer. There was something different about him, a gentleness in his manner that contrasted sharply with the rough edges of the men in Tommy's world. When he laughed at one of her father's jokes, the sound was genuine and warm. "I'm Patrick O'Sullivan," he said, extending his hand to Antonio. "My family just moved to the neighborhood from Bridgeport. We heard this was the best market in Little Italy." "Antonio Benedetto," her father replied, shaking Patrick's hand firmly. "And this is my daughter Rosa. She helps me run the place when she's not busy with her own affairs." Patrick turned to Rosa with a smile that made her heart skip unexpectedly. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Benedetto. Your father's right about the quality here. I can tell this is a place that takes pride in serving the community." Rosa felt heat rise to her cheeks. It had been so long since a man had looked at her with genuine interest, without the calculating gaze she'd grown accustomed to from Tommy's associates. "Thank you, Mr. O'Sullivan. We try to provide the best for our neighbors." Over the next hour, Patrick proved to be an engaging conversationalist. He spoke knowledgeably about everything from the latest Charlie Chaplin picture to the Chicago Cubs' chances in the upcoming baseball season. Rosa learned that he worked as a bookkeeper for a construction company, a respectable job that provided steady income without the dangers that lurked in Chicago's shadows. When Patrick finally left with his purchases, he paused at the door. "Miss Benedetto, I hope you don't think me too forward, but would you perhaps like to attend the Saturday evening picture show at the Oriental Theatre? They're showing The Gold Rush with Charlie Chaplin." Rosa's first instinct was to decline. She was Tommy's girl, had been for 4 years, and despite their problems, she wasn't the type to step out on a man. But something in Patrick's hopeful expression, combined with the memory of another lonely evening ahead, made her hesitate. I'm not sure that would be appropriate," she said finally. "I'm spoken for." Patrick's expression remained kind, understanding. "Of course, I should have assumed someone as lovely as you would be, but if circumstances change, or if you'd simply like a friend to talk with about books, or music, or anything besides business, you know where to find me. I'll be shopping here regularly." After he left, Rosa stood in the doorway watching him walk down Taylor Street, his hands tucked casually in his coat pockets. For the first time in months, she felt seen, appreciated for who she was, rather than what she represented in someone else's plans. That evening, Tommy came home after midnight, counting money as usual. When Rosa mentioned meeting a new customer at her father's store, he barely looked up from his bills. "That's nice, sweetheart," he muttered distractedly. "Hey, did you remember to pick up my shirts from the cleaners? I've got an important meeting tomorrow night." Rosa nodded, swallowing the urge to tell him about Patrick's invitation, about the feeling of being treated like a lady rather than a piece of furniture. Instead, she went to bed alone, as had become her custom, while Tommy worked late into the night planning his next score. She didn't know that across town, Patrick O'Sullivan was also lying awake, thinking about the sad-eyed beauty he'd met that morning, and wondering what kind of man would leave such a treasure unattended. And she certainly didn't know that Patrick O'Sullivan was not just a bookkeeper, but lieutenant to Bugs Moran, sent specifically to gather intelligence on Tommy Castellano's operation through any means necessary. The game was more complex than Rosa could imagine, and she had just become an unwitting player in a deadly contest of territorial ambition and personal vendettanz. 2 weeks into April, Rosa's routine had settled into a predictable pattern of loneliness, punctuated by brief encounters with Patrick O'Sullivan at her father's market. Their conversations had grown longer and more personal, though Rosa was careful to maintain appropriate boundaries. Patrick never pushed, never made her feel uncomfortable, but his genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings created a stark contrast to Tommy's increasing indifference. On this particular Tuesday morning, Rosa was arranging a display of spring vegetables when the bell above the market door chimed with unusual urgency. A young boy, no more than 12, rushed inside carrying a large bouquet of yellow roses wrapped in pristine white paper and tied with a silk ribbon. "Miss Rosa Benedetto?" the boy asked, slightly out of breath from his hurried journey through the neighborhood streets. "Yes, that's me," Rosa replied, her heart racing with confusion. Tommy had never sent her flowers, not even during their courtship years. The gesture was so unlike him that she wondered if there had been some mistake. "These are for you, miss, from a gentleman admirer." The boy thrust the bouquet into her hands and quickly departed before she could ask any questions, leaving Rosa standing in the middle of the market, holding the most beautiful flowers she'd received in years. Antonio emerged from the back room where he'd been organizing inventory. His eyes widened when he saw the elaborate bouquet his daughter was clutching. "Madonna mia! Who sends such expensive flowers to my Rosa?" Rosa examined the bouquet more carefully. The roses were perfectly fresh, clearly expensive, and arranged with professional skill. Tucked among the stems was a small white card. With trembling fingers, she opened it and read the elegant handwriting. "For a lady who deserves to be appreciated every day, your smile brightens even the gloomiest Chicago morning. With admiration, P.O." Her father read over her shoulder, his expression growing stern. "P.O.? Who is this P.O., Rosa? This is not from that Tommy boy. I can tell you that much." Before Rosa could answer, the market door opened again, and Patrick O'Sullivan stepped inside. His eyes immediately fell on the roses in Rosa's hands, and a small, satisfied smile crossed his face. "Good morning, Mr. Benedetto, Miss Rosa," Patrick said cheerfully. "I see the delivery boy found you without any trouble. I hope you don't mind the presumption, but I noticed you admiring the roses in Mrs. Murphy's garden yesterday, and I thought you might enjoy some of your own." Rosa felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment, and something else she didn't want to name. "Mr. O'Sullivan, this is very kind, but I can't accept such an expensive gift. It wouldn't be proper." "Nonsense," Patrick replied gently. "They're just flowers, nothing more. A token of friendship and appreciation for the kindness you and your father have shown me since I arrived in the neighborhood. Surely there's no harm in that." Antonio watched this exchange with growing concern. He'd noticed the way his daughter's face lit up whenever this young Irishman visited their store, and now expensive flowers were appearing. As a father and a businessman who'd survived in Chicago by reading people carefully, Antonio sensed complications brewing. "Mr. O'Sullivan," Antonio said diplomatically, "while we appreciate your generosity, my Rosa is spoken for, as I believe she mentioned to you before. Her young man is protective of what he considers his." Patrick's expression remained pleasant, but something cold flickered in his pale blue eyes. "Of course, Mr. Benedetto. I wouldn't dream of interfering in Miss Rosa's personal relationships, but surely even a spoken-for woman can receive flowers from a friend, especially when that friend notices she seems underappreciated by her current circumstances." The subtle emphasis on underappreciated made Rosa's heart skip. Someone had noticed her loneliness, her sadness, the way she'd been slowly disappearing into the background of Tommy's increasingly demanding life. The validation felt like water to a woman dying of thirst. "They are beautiful," Rosa admitted quietly, burying her face in the fragrant blooms. "Thank you, Patrick. You're very thoughtful." As Patrick made his usual purchases and engaged in friendly conversation with her father, Rosa found herself studying him more carefully than ever before. There was something almost too perfect about his manners, his timing, his ability to say exactly what she needed to hear. But in her starved state for affection and attention, these subtle warning signs were easily dismissed. After Patrick left, Antonio confronted his daughter directly. "Rosa, mia cara, you must be very careful with this man. I see how you look at him, and I see how he looks at you. Nothing good can come from accepting gifts from strange men when you belong to someone like Tommy Castellano." "I don't belong to anyone, Papa," Rosa replied with more defiance than she'd shown in months. "And Tommy barely notices I exist anymore. When was the last time he brought me flowers? When was the last time he took me anywhere or asked about my day or treated me like I mattered?" Antonio sighed heavily. He'd watched his daughter's spirits slowly crushing under the weight of her relationship with Tommy, but he also understood the dangerous waters she was entering. In their neighborhood, crossing men like Tommy Castellano could have deadly consequences. That evening, Rosa placed the yellow roses in her best crystal vase and set them on the kitchen table where Tommy would be sure to see them. She told herself she wasn't trying to provoke him, that she simply wanted to brighten their apartment with something beautiful. But deep down, she hoped the flowers might spark some reaction from the man who'd grown so cold and distant. Tommy arrived home after 11, as had become his habit. He was counting the night's receipts when his eyes fell on the elaborate bouquet. He stopped mid-count, his dark eyes narrowing as he studied the expensive arrangement. Where did these come from? His voice was dangerously quiet. "A friend sent them," Rosa replied, trying to keep her tone casual while her heart hammered against her ribs. "Someone who noticed I seemed to enjoy flowers." Tommy's hands slowly clenched into fists. In his world, gifts between men and women had specific meanings, and expensive flowers sent to another man's woman was tantamount to a declaration of war. What friend? The question came out as a growl. Rosa lifted her chin with newfound courage, fed by weeks of neglect, and the memory of how Patrick had looked at her like she was precious. "Someone who actually notices I exist, Tommy. Someone who remembers what it means to treat a lady with respect." The explosion she expected didn't come. Instead, Tommy's face went completely blank, which Rosa had learned was far more dangerous than his anger. He was calculating, planning, deciding how to handle this challenge to his authority and possession. "Is that so?" Tommy said softly, picking up one of the roses and examining it with the care of a man who understood the cost of such things. "Well, sweetheart, I think it's time I reminded this friend of yours exactly whose woman you are." The game had begun, and Rosa had no idea she'd just lit the fuse on a powder keg that would explode both their worlds. Tommy spent the next 3 days conducting his own investigation with the methodical precision that had made him one of Chicago's most feared operators. Within 48 hours, he knew everything about Patrick O'Sullivan, his real job as Bugs Moran's lieutenant, his apartment on North Clark Street, his grandmother who didn't exist, and most importantly, his deliberate targeting of Rosa as a way to get under Tommy's skin. The revelation hit Tommy like a sledgehammer to the chest. This wasn't just some neighborhood Romeo trying to steal his girl. This was psychological warfare orchestrated by his most dangerous rival. Moran had found Tommy's weakness and was exploiting it with surgical precision, using Rosa's loneliness and Tommy's own neglect as weapons against him. On Friday evening, Tommy sat in the back booth of Salvatore's restaurant, a legitimate front for one of his money laundering operations. Across from him, Mickey Torino methodically cleaned his fingernails with a switchblade while delivering his report on Patrick O'Sullivan's movements. "He's been visiting the market every other day for 3 weeks, Mickey said in his gravelly voice, the result of a throat injury from a previous territorial dispute. "Always buys something small, always talks to the girl for 20-30 minutes. Real smooth operator, boss. Got the old man eating out of his hand too." Tommy's jaw clenched as he absorbed this information. The systematic nature of Patrick's approach made it clear this was no chance encounter. Moran had studied Tommy's routine, identified his vulnerabilities, and deployed one of his most charming lieutenants to exploit them. What else? Tommy demanded, his voice barely controlled. Word is, Moran's planning something big. This flower thing. Getting close to your girl. It's all part of making you lose your cool, make mistakes. He wants you distracted, emotional, thinking with your heart instead of your head. Mickey was right, and Tommy knew it. In their business, emotional reactions got you killed. But knowing it was a trap didn't make the fury burning in his chest any less real. Every time he thought about another man sending flowers to Rosa, about her face lighting up when she talked about her friend, about Moran's soldiers laughing over drinks about how they'd gotten to Tommy Castellano through a woman. His vision went red with rage. "Set up a meeting," Tommy said finally. "I want to talk to this Patrick O'Sullivan face to face." "Boss, that's exactly what Moran wants. You go after his boy directly. It gives him excuse to escalate. Better we handle this quiet-like, make the Irishman disappear without fingerprints leading back to us." But Tommy was beyond strategic thinking. 4 years of taking Rosa for granted, of assuming she'd always be there waiting for him, had blinded him to how starved she'd become for affection and attention. Now another man was providing what Tommy had failed to give, and worse. That man was his enemy, using Rosa as ammunition in a war she didn't even know she was fighting. "No," Tommy growled, standing up from the booth. "This is personal now. Nobody sends flowers to my girl and walks away laughing about it. Nobody." The next morning, Tommy put on his best suit, slicked back his hair with extra care, and did something he hadn't done in over a year. He bought flowers for Rosa. Not just any flowers, but 3 dozen red roses from the most expensive florist in downtown Chicago, arranged in a crystal vase that cost more than most people made in a month. When he arrived at Benedetto's market carrying the elaborate display, both Rosa and her father stared in shock. Tommy Castellano bringing flowers to his woman in broad daylight was unprecedented, and Antonio immediately sensed danger in the gesture. "Rosa, sweetheart," Tommy said loudly enough for everyone in the crowded market to hear. "I realized I haven't been showing you how much you mean to me. These are just a small token of my appreciation for the most beautiful girl in Chicago." Rosa's eyes widened as she accepted the massive bouquet. The roses were stunning, but there was something cold and calculating in Tommy's expression that made her stomach knot with anxiety. This wasn't romance. This was a territorial marking, a public declaration of ownership. "They're beautiful, Tommy," she said carefully, aware that several neighborhood women had stopped their shopping to observe this unusual display. "But you didn't need to spend so much money." "Nothing's too good for my girl," Tommy replied, pulling Rosa close and kissing her with theatrical passion. "I want everyone to know how lucky I am to have you." As if summoned by some cruel twist of fate, Patrick O'Sullivan chose that moment to enter the market. He took in the scene immediately. Tommy's possessive embrace, the expensive roses, the territorial message being broadcast to the entire neighborhood. His pale blue eyes met Tommy's dark ones across Rosa's shoulder, and both men recognized the moment of truth had arrived. "Well, well," Tommy said, slowly releasing Rosa but keeping one arm firmly around her waist. "You must be the friend who's been sending flowers to my girl." Patrick stepped forward, with the same calm confidence he'd always displayed. But Rosa could see tension in his jaw, danger crackling in the air between the two men like electricity before a storm. "Tommy Castellano, I presume," Patrick said evenly. Patrick O'Sullivan. "I was just being neighborly, helping Miss Benedetto feel appreciated. Nothing more than that." "Neighborly," Tommy repeated, the word dripping with menace. "How neighborly of you, Mr. O'Sullivan. Tell me, what neighborhood are you from originally? Because I don't recognize your face from around Little Italy." Rosa felt trapped between the two men, finally understanding that she'd been naive about Patrick's intentions and blind to the larger forces at play. This wasn't about romance or friendship. This was about power, territory, and masculine pride played out on a stage where she was nothing more than a prize to be won or lost. "Perhaps we should discuss this outside," Patrick suggested, his hand moving subtly toward his coat. "No need to involve the lady or her father in business matters." Tommy's smile was pure predator. "Oh, but this is very much about the lady, Mr. O'Sullivan. See, when someone disrespects what's mine, when they use my woman to send messages, well, that requires a very personal response." The market had gone completely silent. Even Antonio had retreated behind his counter, recognizing the signs of impending violence. Rosa realized with growing horror that her innocent acceptance of Patrick's attention had triggered something that could end in bloodshed. "Tommy, please," she whispered, tugging at his sleeve. Let's just go home. There's no need for trouble. But Tommy's rage had been building for days, fed by wounded pride, territorial instinct, and the humiliating realization that his enemy had played him perfectly. The trap had been set, and he was walking into it with his eyes wide open, driven by fury that made strategic thinking impossible. The explosion Rosa had feared was finally here, and she was standing at ground zero. The confrontation that erupted outside Benedetto's market became the stuff of neighborhood legend, whispered about in hushed tones for years afterward. Tommy's rage finally exploded in a brutal display of violence that left Patrick O'Sullivan hospitalized with a broken jaw, 3 cracked ribs, and a shattered understanding of just how dangerous Chicago's underworld could be when personal honor was at stake. But the victory came at a terrible price. Within hours of the beating, Bugs Moran's retaliation was swift and merciless. Tommy's warehouse on Halstead Street went up in flames, taking with it 3 months' worth of premium Canadian whiskey and nearly $200,000 in inventory. 2 of Tommy's runners were found floating in the Chicago River, and his most profitable speakeasy was raided by police who'd suddenly developed an interest in enforcing Prohibition laws, the war Tommy had tried to avoid by maintaining careful boundaries with. Moran's territory had begun in earnest, triggered by his own inability to control his emotions. As he sat in the back room of his remaining speakeasy, surveying the wreckage of his carefully built empire, Tommy finally understood the true cost of his neglect. Rosa hadn't spoken to him since the beating. She'd watched in horror as the man she'd once loved transformed into a monster before her eyes, pummeling Patrick with a savagery that revealed the true darkness lurking beneath Tommy's civilized veneer. The gentle bookkeeper who'd shown her kindness lay unconscious on the sidewalk, while Tommy stood over him, knuckles bloody, chest heaving with the exertion of violence. "You want to send flowers to my girl?" Tommy had screamed at Patrick's motionless form. "You want to play games with Tommy Castellano? This is what happens when you disrespect what's mine." But even as he'd spoken those words, Tommy could see the disgust and fear in Rosa's eyes. She'd backed away from him as if he were a rabid animal, and when he'd reached for her, she'd flinched like he might strike her too. In that moment, Tommy realized he'd won the battle but lost something far more precious than territory or pride. Now, 3 days later, Rosa was packing her belongings in their apartment above Marcelli's bakery. Tommy watched from the doorway as she carefully folded her dresses into a worn suitcase, her movements efficient and final. The yellow roses Patrick had sent were wilted in their vase, and Tommy's expensive red roses had been thrown in the garbage. "Where will you go?" Tommy asked quietly, his voice hoarse from 3 days of drinking and smoking. "My cousin Maria has a place in New York," Rosa replied without looking at him. "I can work in her restaurant, start over somewhere where people don't know what I've been mixed up in." Tommy stepped into the room, his hands shaking slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a thick envelope stuffed with cash, enough money to buy Rosa a comfortable life far from Chicago's violence. "Take this," he said, setting the envelope on the bed beside her suitcase. "It's enough to get you settled. Maybe open your own place someday. You deserve better than what I gave you." Rosa finally looked at him, and Tommy was shocked by how much older she looked, how the light in her dark eyes had dimmed to barely glowing embers. "I don't want your money, Tommy. I never wanted your money. I wanted you. The real you. Not this stranger who comes home covered in other people's blood. This is the real me, Rosa. This is who I've always been. You just didn't want to see it." She closed her suitcase and turned to face him fully. "No, Tommy. The real you was the man who brought me flowers after church, who talked about buying a house and having children, who made me laugh until my sides hurt. That man got lost somewhere along the way, buried under all this violence and greed." Tommy felt something break inside his chest, a pain more acute than any physical wound he'd ever suffered. Maybe I could change, get out of the business, go legitimate like we always talked about." Rosa's smile was infinitely sad. "We both know that's not possible now. You've made too many enemies, burned too many bridges, and even if you could walk away, I've seen what you're capable of when you're angry. I can't live with that kind of fear anymore." As Rosa prepared to leave, Tommy made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of their relationship. He got down on one knee beside her suitcase and pulled out a diamond ring he'd been carrying for over a year, waiting for the right moment that had never seemed to come. Marry me. Rosa, I know I messed up. I know I took you for granted. But marry me, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Rosa stared at the ring. A beautiful solitaire that would have made her heart sing with joy just months earlier. Now it looked like nothing more than another attempt to buy her compliance, to chain her to a life that was slowly killing her spirit. I can't. Tommy, I won't be owned by anyone ever again. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the door, pausing only to look back at the man who'd once been the center of her world. I hope you find peace someday, Tommy. I really do, but I can't sacrifice my soul waiting for you to find yours. After Rosa left, Tommy sat alone in their apartment, surrounded by the ghost of their life together. The silence was deafening after years of coming home to her quiet presence, her gentle questions about his day, her attempts to maintain normalcy in their increasingly chaotic world. The war with Moran continued for another 6 months, claiming dozens of lives and ultimately leading to the infamous Lincoln Park massacre that would make headlines across the nation. Tommy survived, but his organization never fully recovered from the losses sustained in those brutal months of retaliation and counter-retaliation. Years later, when Tommy was serving time in Alcatraz for tax evasion, he would receive occasional letters from Rosa. She'd married a good man in New York, an accountant who took her to picture shows and brought her flowers every Friday. She had 2 children and a small house with a garden where she grew the yellow roses she'd always loved. In her final letter, Rosa wrote, I hope you understand now that love isn't about possession or control. It's about cherishing what you have while you have it, about making the people you care about feel valued and safe. I learned too late that you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, but I also learned that it's never too late to save yourself. Tommy kept that letter until the day he died, a reminder of the woman he'd lost through his own neglect, and the man he might have been if he'd chosen love over power, tenderness over violence. In the end, the flowers had been more than just a rival's provocation. They'd been a mirror reflecting everything Tommy had failed to give the woman who'd loved him, and everything he'd lost when pride and rage consumed his capacity for redemption. The story of Tommy Castellano became a cautionary tale whispered in Chicago's underworld, a reminder that in the game of love and war, sometimes the greatest victories come from knowing when to lay down your weapons and fight for what truly matters.